The Victorian era is remembered for its strict morality, rigid class divisions, and obsession with respectability. However, behind this facade of righteousness existed a much more complex and hidden reality. In a world where homosexuality was considered a crime and a scandal, men and women who felt attracted to people of the same sex lived amid danger, secrecy, and in some cases, resistance. From intellectual circles that exalted Greek love to the brutal laws that sent figures like Oscar Wilde to prison, today we will explore the history of homosexuality in the Victorian era, its prohibitions, hidden codes, and the lives of those who defied the norms of their time. Before we continue with the topic, we invite you to subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Without further ado, let's begin. Criminalization and harsh penalties. During the Victorian era, male homosexuality was harshly repressed and punished by British laws. Although sodomy had already been illegal and punishable by death until 1861, persecution did not end with the abolition of that sentence. In 1885, the Criminal Law Amendment Act, known as the Labouchere Amendment, broadened the scope of criminalization by making any act of gross indecency between men a crime, without the need to prove that a sexual relationship had occurred. This law was particularly dangerous because it allowed any expression of affection or desire between men to be legally persecuted. State repression and fear of being discovered led many gay men to live in constant fear, hiding their identities and relationships to avoid severe punishments, which included imprisonment and hard labor. Famous cases and scandals. One of the most notorious cases of the time was the 1895 trial of Oscar Wilde, which became a massive media scandal. Wilde, a renowned writer and playwright, was accused by the father of his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, who publicly called him a sodomite. Although Wilde initially sued for libel, the case turned against him when evidence of his relationships with working-class young men came to light. He was found guilty of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, a punishment that severely deteriorated his health and led to his exile after release. His story symbolizes the double standards of Victorian society, which applauded his literary genius while punishing him for his private life. Other lesser-known but equally shocking cases involved aristocrats and public figures who were exposed and humiliated for their sexual orientation, facing social exile and financial ruin. Language and secret codes. Faced with the constant threat of persecution, gay men developed a system of codes and euphemisms to communicate and recognize one another. One of the most commonly used terms was Uranian, popularized by activist and writer Karl Heinrich Ulrichs to refer to those attracted to the same sex. This term was adopted by Victorian intellectuals and artists as a more acceptable way to talk about homosexuality without arousing suspicion. Additionally, expressions like special friendship or aesthetic were used to describe relationships that, although seemingly platonic, often hid romantic or sexual bonds. In more underground circles, gestures, fashion, and certain habits also served as signs of mutual recognition. Despite repression, these codes allowed many people to meet and live out their relationships discreetly. Ambiguity in artistic and literary representation. Homosexuality also manifested in the literature and art of the time, though veiled and ambiguous to evade censorship. Writers such as John Addington Symonds and Walter Pater explored male desire in their works, using mythological and classical references to disguise their true meaning. The poetry of Walt Whitman, though from the United States, had a significant impact on the British homosexual community, as it exalted love and camaraderie between men with an intensity that defied the conventions of the time. Another notable example is the aestheticism promoted by Oscar Wilde, where beauty and art were used as means of expressing feelings and desires that could not be openly declared. Many of these texts were interpreted subversively by those who shared this identity, finding in them a reflection of their own experiences and emotions. Clubs and secret gatherings. Despite strict Victorian morality and legal persecution, there were underground spaces where gay men could meet with greater safety. It is rumored that some brothels in London offered private rooms for same-sex encounters, with the complicity of owners and staff. Additionally, there were exclusive clubs for aristocrats and high society, where homosexuality was an open secret, tolerated as long as it remained discreet. Among the best-known places was the Cleveland Street Club, which became the center of a scandal in the 1880s when it was discovered that members of the nobility and government officials were frequent patrons. These spaces not only allowed for romantic encounters, but also offered a sense of community in a society that openly rejected sexual diversity. Although the risk of being discovered was high, many men found in these circles a chance to live their identity more freely, even if only fleetingly and in secret. The British colonies and homosexuality. During the Victorian era, while homosexuality was harshly persecuted in the United Kingdom, some British Empire colonies offered a more permissive environment, where social norms regarding sexuality were less rigid or interpreted differently. In places like India, Egypt, and certain regions of Southeast Asia, cultural traditions did not openly condemn same-sex relationships, attracting British travelers in search of greater freedom. Writers like Forster and British aristocrats found in these territories a refuge to explore their identity without the constant fear of repression. However, this apparent tolerance did not mean widespread acceptance, as the arrival of European colonial thinking gradually introduced stricter sexual norms, progressively imposing Victorian morality in these regions. Women and the lack of legislation. One of the particularities of Victorian legislation against homosexuality is that it was directed exclusively at men. Female homosexuality, on the other hand, was not explicitly prohibited or criminalized. It is believed that this omission was deliberate and that Queen Victoria herself influenced the decision, supposedly because she could not imagine that lesbianism existed. Although the truth of this claim cannot be confirmed, the fact remains that women who had relationships with other women did not face legal penalties in the same way as men. However, this did not mean they were free from social repression. Women who displayed behaviors that defied gender norms were subject to ridicule, rejection, and even confinement in psychiatric institutions. Many of them chose to live in discreet relationships under the appearance of strong friendships, in what was known as Boston marriages. Even though they were not legally persecuted, social pressure and family control continued to be limiting factors that condemned any expression of love outside the heteronormative standard. The use of science to justify persecution. As Victorian society progressed, homosexuality ceased to be seen solely as a religious sin or a legal crime and began to be analyzed from a medical point of view. With the rise of psychiatry and sexology in the 19th century, several scholars attempted to classify sexual orientations using scientific terms, which in many cases led to the pathologization of homosexuality. Doctors such as Henry Havelock Ellis studied the subject and promoted the idea that it was a natural but abnormal disorder, a deviation that could be explained in biological or psychological terms. Other scientists, however, were more radical and considered homosexuality a moral degeneration that should be corrected through medical treatments or even coercive measures such as chemical castration. These pseudoscientific discourses were used as justification to continue legally persecuting homosexual people, arguing that their behavior was a disease dangerous to society and the family. In this way, science became a weapon to reinforce discrimination instead of promoting greater understanding and acceptance of sexual diversity. The role of theaters and cross-dressing. During the Victorian era, theater played a crucial role in exploring gender identity and sexuality, especially for those whose orientation or gender expression did not fit within the rigid social norms of the time. In a context where male homosexuality was harshly punished, and any deviation from the norm could mean social exile, the stage offered a space where certain boundaries could be blurred under the excuse of performance. Cross-dressing was a common practice in theaters, particularly in burlesque and amateur theater companies. In part, this was due to the tradition inherited from Elizabethan theater, where men played all roles, including female ones. Although by the Victorian era women had already taken their place on stage, cross-dressing continued to be used by both men and women. Actresses like Vesta Tilley became famous for playing male roles, which attracted public interest and, in some cases, generated homoerotic attraction disguised as entertainment. Changes toward the 20th century. Toward the end of the Victorian era, the first attempts began to emerge to reform laws against homosexuality and to change the social perception of sexual diversity. Although society remained deeply hostile, Certain progressive sectors began to question the harshness of the penalties imposed on homosexual individuals. Figures like Edward Carpenter, a poet and activist, promoted the acceptance of sexual diversity within the socialist and feminist movements, arguing that love should not be regulated by arbitrary norms. Through his writings and personal life, Carpenter showed that it was possible to live openly as a homosexual without renouncing the struggle for social rights. Although his influence at the time was limited, he laid the groundwork for future sexual liberation movements that would gain strength in the 20th century. The changes were slow but inevitable. Little by little, the view of homosexuality as a crime or illness began to crumble, and the 20th century brought new discussions and advances that, although not free from resistance, would mark the beginning of a more organized fight for LGBTQ+ rights. Thank you for joining us until the end of the video. Don't forget to share the link, hit the like button, and subscribe to the channel for more historical content.